Welcome to Queen Mary, those of you who are not already from Queen Mary, and to this celebration of Quentin Skinner's work and his contribution to this university and to the discipline of the history of political thought in London. As most of you know, Quentin spent many years in Cambridge, where he helped establish that university as a leading centre for the history of political thought in the world. He also established a reputation as one of the leading figures in the humanities and social sciences in the world. In 2008, Quentin moved to Queen Mary, and the centre of gravity for the discipline moved with him. In the years subsequently, he helped establish a thriving community of intellectual historians in London, as well as the London MA in the history of political thought and intellectual history, which is taught across Queen Mary, UCL, KCL and Birkbeck. Quentin retired from teaching last year after more than 60 years, but his legacy and teaching and research is immense, and it will continue to unfold for many years to come. It is that legacy that the 6 papers today will help to explore. 5 of the 6 speakers were Quentin's students. 3 of the speakers have helped to teach the MA in the history of political thought and intellectual history. 2 of them continue to do so, while the others were brilliant students who either studied in that MA, including in Quentin's own module, or were supervised by Quentin in a PhD at Queen Mary. The impact of Quentin's thought has been felt in a great diversity of fields in the humanities and social sciences, but today we will only gesture to a few of those. The first session will focus on philosophy and politics. The second will focus on feminist political thought and the history of women intellectuals. And the third session will be concerned with literature. Something that is also not on the programme, there's a couple of things not on the programme. One of them is that Quentin will say a few words at the end. Another is, equally importantly, that we'll have a tea break after the first session, and then we won't have a break between the second and third sessions. Before we go to the 6 papers, we've asked Professor Philip Ogden to say a few words about Quentin's appointment at Queen Mary. Philip is an emeritus professor of geography. He was vice principal for the humanities and social sciences at Queen Mary from 1998 to 2006, and he was senior vice principal from 2005 to 2011. In that role, he oversaw a period of expansion at Queen Mary and many new building projects, including the building in which we're currently sitting. It was also in that role that Philip oversaw Quentin's appointment in 2008. So, Philip, if you'd like to begin, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Could I check you can all hear me? Yep, really good. Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to Andrew for inviting me to say a few words of introduction to today's event. It's a privilege to help to celebrate Quentin's distinguished career and in particular his remarkable London years. These London years began appropriately enough over a glass of wine in a restaurant in Mile End when I was Vice Principal for the Humanities. Quentin had given a lecture in his role then as Distinguished Visiting Professor in the Humanities, following on from George Steiner and Stuart Hall in that role. When he'd left us for the Cambridge train, Professor Daniel Pick, then in QM History and now at Birkbeck, mentioned that Quentin would soon be retiring and wondered whether there might be a more permanent role for him at Queen Mary. I have to say I thought this was an absolutely wonderful idea, and it was indeed from that conversation, really, that the seeds of the London years were sown. Now, in my 14 years as vice principal in a variety of roles, I did come in for occasional flack, as one inevitably does in this sort of role. And those of you who are in any sort of management role know that that's par for the course. And you have to develop a thick carapace of resistance to criticism. In my case, one of my many failings was to appoint too many professors. This was apparently a particular failing in history. I'd taken a rather naive and possibly now unfashionable view that one can never have too many professors of history. I like to think that this criticism was fairly light-hearted, and indeed I see several of those we appointed sitting in the audience this afternoon. But the perfectly reasonable point made to me was that favouring the more established rather than the young and rising meant that there might perhaps be less of a commitment to teaching, innovation, and to the university itself. Yet when I mentioned to some senior scholars in history, English, and other schools in the university that we were thinking of appointing a very senior scholar from Cambridge, there was in fact huge enthusiasm, and enthusiasm subsequently justified well beyond our expectations at the time. I shall turn to Quentin's contribution over the ensuing 15 years in a moment, but let me first mention Barbara Beaumont, a figure of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, after whom the chair newly created by the university for Quentin was named. Beaumont it was who founded the new Philosophical Institute in Mile End in the early 19th century, from which in a real sense the present Queen Mary University of London is descended. Beaumont's interesting character, variously artist, pamphleteer, sharpshooter, founder of a savings bank and philanthropist, is set out in a huge stone memorial now preserved in the entrance to the People's Palace here on the Mile End campus. As the College History of 1939 explains, his aim was to improve the condition of the people of London's East End. It was his object to bring them something of the joy and wonder that came from the individual's first contact with fine music and good literature, with the discovery of the pleasures of art and popular science, freed from the baneful excitement of intoxicating liquors. Beaumont developed a degree of nobility and a strong social sense. He had an integrity of character, and this seemed nicely to me to encapsulate the Quentin that we have come to know. Although I hope that intoxicating liquors are not off the agenda for later on this afternoon. The college history also notes that he was a man full of surprises, full of psychological riddles, and from the beginning there was an element of mystery. But alas, I don't have time to go into that with respect to the recent holder of the chair. Suffice it to say, from the university's point of view, that Quentin has, over the last 15 years, made a contribution to the modern institution of which Beaumont would be proud, as we all are. We shall hear shortly from those much better qualified than I am about aspects of that contribution. But from my own perspective, I'd like just to mention 4 things, if I may. First, his publication record over these years of deeply scholarly and influential books and papers, and his presentation of those ideas in so many locations here and across the world have much enhanced Queen Mary's reputation. Secondly, his commitment to teaching, which now I think does span over 60 years, as Andrew mentioned, and to innovation in that teaching, not least through the MA programme that he set up here at Queen Mary with colleagues in the University of London. All those things have been hugely valuable to the institution. And thirdly, his interest in the institution itself and its good governance. His London years have shown his commitment to this university and to the welfare of those associated with it. Many of us have benefited from his sage advice and counsel and have come greatly to value our friendship with Quentin and Susie. I particularly remember his interest in and enthusiasm for this new building for the School of History in which we currently sit. It mattered to him that the university was, in the broadest sense, able to flourish and demonstrate values of integrity, professionalism, and care for others to the benefit of students and staff alike. Finally, and above all, Quentin demonstrates why the humanities must be a central and respected part of any university that merits the name. At a time when I know humanities are under threat in many places, sceptics need only look at Quentin's career, and not least over the last 15 years, to gain inspiration and guidance. Thank you, Quentin. Thank you.
Okay, so we'll now go to the first of our 3 panels. Our first speaker in the panel on philosophy and politics is Richard Burke. Richard was elected to be Professor of the History of Political Thought at Cambridge in 2018. Prior to that, he was at Queen Mary for many years and with Angus Gowland at UCL, he established the joint Queen Mary and UCL Masters in the History of Political Thought and Intellectual History, in which he taught also for many years with Quentin. Today he will be speaking on philosophy and the history of political thought. Richard.
Okay, great. I take it the microphone is still working. There's been a changeover of personnel. Well, it really is a particular pleasure for me to speak at this event celebrating Quentin's London years, an occasion which doubles as a reflection on the future of intellectual history. I've been asked to speak specifically about philosophy and political thought. I think that this is an especially appropriate topic for an occasion such as this, since the relationship between political philosophy and its history stands, I think we can all agree, close to the centre of Quentin Skinner's career. Well, standing back, and in general, I think it's right to say that the emergence of since the emergence of modern academic disciplines, relations between history and philosophy have been fraught. It's common among philosophers to regard history as superficial, a mere heaping up of facts unconcerned with deeper truths. Well, historians have tended to repay the compliment by viewing philosophy as indigestible, impossibly abstract, and of course largely irrelevant. As a result of these prevailing attitudes, some historians, it could be said, evince a tendency towards anti-intellectualism, while many philosophers descend into unapologetic utopianism. One of the great triumphs of Quentin's career has been his challenge to these predispositions, brought about by creating a space in between these domains. It's true that dominant approaches in both fields are likely to remain unchanged as we go forward. Nonetheless, it's also true that Quentin constructed a bridge between the domains. This fragile architecture, and it may still be fragile, has enabled scholars with both historical and philosophical interests to survive. I think that this alone is an extraordinary gift to subsequent generations in the humanities. The Skinnerian bequest in this regard has been twofold: intellectual and institutional. The London years form a vital part of this institutional legacy. When Quentin arrived at Queen Mary in 2008, I was here then, it's good to be back. We had a structure for advancing the cause of intellectual history, but not what one might call the hereditary prestige. There were dedicated collaborators, above all, along with myself, Georgios Varoufakis and Angus Gowland, both here today. We also had the means to advance our mission, if that's not too portentous a term. The seminar on the history of political ideas at the Institute for Historical Research, and a new intercollegiate master's programme in political thought and intellectual history, anchored in cooperation between Queen Mary and UCL. But we lacked prominence and therefore numbers. Well, Quentin attracted these, that's to say numbers, in droves. Quentin's success was partly a result of his astonishing reputation. His name, after all, was synonymous with the subject that we were teaching. Within a year of his arrival, the MA had become a remarkable success story. Some of our graduates are here today, many of them established academics themselves. Paul Sagar, Jessica Patterson, Adam Woodhouse, there's a bit of a list here, I should say, but I think names are important. Max Skjønsberg, Signe Allen, Caroline Ashcroft, Lisa Kattenberg, Seamus Flaherty, Sarah Wilford, Peter Davidson, Adela Halo, Sam Pallas, Emily Steinhauer, Robin Mills, Odile Panetta, Max Ridge, Nicole Menezes, Quentin will remember these names, Vanessa Lim, Alvin Chen, and Elena Zeng. Students who pursued PhDs in London have similarly prospered. Julia Nichols, Joanne Paul, Mads Jensen, Giorgio Lazul, Callum Barrell, and Alexandra Chadwick, to name just a few. Well, then our academic numbers swelled across the erstwhile London colleges. They were colleges of a university then. Things have changed. Susan James had already arrived at Birkbeck. Avi Lifshitz would soon appear at UCL, and Joel Isaac at QMUL. Then Gareth Stedman-Jones came to QMUL, and I understand there'll be a separate celebration for him on another occasion. Later, Niall O'Flaherty came to KCL, Ian Stewart to UCL, Katrina Forrester to QMUL, Mira Siegelberg to Queen Mary, Hannah Dawson to KCL, William Selinger to UCL, Wasim Yacoub to Queen Mary, Dina Guzainova to the LSE, and last but not least, Samuel Zeitlin at UCL. Well, successors may take these accomplishments for granted, and that's what they are, accomplishments in the profession, but people actually had to build it. Max Skjønsberg will talk about Quentin's astonishing success as a teacher. All I'll add is that his student evaluations in those years came directly to me. And I must say, I never ceased to be amazed by the fact that I used to ask myself, how on earth did the man never score below outstanding? But Skinner-related activities went beyond the classroom. Under the auspices of the Rubenstein Lecture, we hosted first Quentin himself, then Jonathan Israel, J.G.A. Pocock, Lorraine Dustin, David Armitage, Peter Brown, Carlo Ginsberg, Marty Koskiniemi, Susan Patterson, Samuel Moyne, Melissa Lane, and Sanjay Subramaniam. There was also the annual graduate conference still running, and the London Summer School. Not sure what happened to that. Finally, we ran annual international symposia in the humanities and social sciences, focusing on major publications. These included events devoted to Skinner and Pettit, Tuck and Waldron, Ian Hacking, Noel Malcolm, Nadia Urbanati, Shayla Benhabib, and Martin Jay. Well, during my years working directly with Quentin, we also secured external funding for 2 international research networks. The proceedings of both have subsequently appeared with Cambridge University Press. Quentin was a dynamic presence at all the relevant events. For me, he was the consummate collaborator, efficient, effective. Of course, you can be efficient without being effective, so that's an important detail. Energetic and judicious. I marvelled at how he stilled all opposition with a sort of lethal form of politeness, a technique which I've never managed to perfect myself, as some of you will have noticed. Quentin brought to every occasion the deepest learning and the quickest intelligence. And then there was the accumulated weight of peerless intellectual achievement. While at Queen Mary, he added to a prodigious array of path-breaking publications, Hobbes and Republican Liberty in the year of his arrival at Queen Mary, then Forensic Shakespeare in 2014, then From Humanism to Hobbes in 2018. We eagerly await his new book on neo-Roman liberty. Each of these volumes embodies Quentin's signature insights. Above all, as I indicated at the start, and as of course we know, his project has been to contextualize past intellectual culture. As he advances, he builds on deep foundations laid in the 1960s. Now, every scholar has their own peculiar style of self-presentation. Quentin describes his particular self in Cartesian rather than Humean terms. On the face of it, he has always been the same person, or cogito, never a sequence of accidents adapting as the currents change. Since reading Collingwood at school, he's inclined to imply his course has been fixed. Now, it is true that Quentin's career was marked by a sort of staggering, really, precociousness. In his late 20s, he was already reconceptualizing how philosophy should be studied. However, despite the seamless display, I think there was a subtle shift mid-course. Quentin and his original collaborators, who were later called, for better or for worse, the Cambridge School, set about historicising past works of philosophy. This meant taking them on their own terms rather than subjecting them to external criticism. It is now accepted that this approach transformed the study of political thought. But the method also attracted the charge of antiquarianism. If Hobbes and Locke were firmly rooted in the past, what do they have to say to us today? In response, there came the Cambridge turn. Now it was claimed that the classic texts could be assigned a context in, as it were, the world we have lost, yet still have traction extending into our own time. So, while Machiavelli belonged to Renaissance Florence, his theory of liberty might nonetheless be revived for use today. Well, this raises an acute philosophical problem. How can an explicitly superannuated value be reanimated under new conditions which cannot sustain its life? This surely counts as the central question for the future of political thought, not least as its study migrates, as it increasingly does, from history departments to politics ones. Basic historical understanding dictates that we cannot judge the past by contemporary standards. That's, as it were, Room 101. This insight was invented in Germany between Herder and Hegel. By the same reasoning, the ancients cannot supply the standards by which we should judge ourselves. The remote past, in Wittgensteinian language, is simply an alien form of life. And so we have to ask ourselves, is every historical civilization exempt from our criticism? The whole edifice of Hegel's thought, as I deviate into a current preoccupation of my own, was designed to address precisely this conundrum. For him, civilizations were distinct, but not radically incommensurable. It might be that mummification fitted in with Egyptian culture, just as Newtonianism was a product of early modern Europe. But that was not to accord divergent viewpoints equal rational status. On the contrary, on Hegelian premises, rival perspectives were neither equally true nor equally valuable. However, crucially, this conclusion did not position the interpreter as an external critic. This insight, I believe, adds positively to Quentin's legacy. Expositors on Hegel's model don't stand above their predecessors. They don't hold them to standards of which they had no conception. Instead, our job is to trace the imminent failure of earlier schemes of thought. So, for example, it's necessary to explain why Christianity yielded to Enlightenment, or why dogmatism succumbed to scientific rationality, a good thing I take it, or why caste-based societies submitted to egalitarian social structures, also, I'm taking it, a good thing. Well, the currently popular explanation for these world historical transmutations is that power or imperialism can account, and these alone can account for the succession. However, in that case, if they're the product of the merest contingency, then all our values lack rudimentary justification. And with this outcome, I'm sure we'll feel we really ought to think again. So let me drive my point home by finishing with an Hegelian provocation, whose implications I believe Quentin would appreciate. For Hegel, writing in the early 19th century, slavery was intrinsically wrong, though it was valid for the Romans, not to mention countless other civilizations, incidentally, across the globe. Moreover, in addition to what Hegel regarded as its implicit depravity, it became explicitly nefarious in modern Western culture. Now, here is a case of a paradigm shift in moral perception across time. Do we really want to say that this revolutionary transformation is simply a function of power, the plaything of interests, an idle contingency delivered by chance? Hegel spent his career mounting the alternative case. After more than half a century of postmodernism and postcolonialism, we might pause to give his arguments a hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. It's nice to know you can never escape your student evaluations. The next speaker is Max Schonsberg, who is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at the Faculty of History in the University of Cambridge. He was formerly a graduate of the London MA in the History of Political Thought and Intellectual History, before completing his PhD at the London School of Economics in 2018. Since that time, 2018, Max has published a monograph in the Ideas and Context series and 4 edited volumes, as well as publishing several articles in eminent journals. Today he will be speaking on the history of political thought and the Whig interpretation of history. Max.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thank you for the invitation. I hope you can all hear me. I hope my microphone is working. Okay, so I would like to begin by paying tribute to Quentin as a teacher. So I had the great privilege, together with many others who are here today, of being taught by Quentin here at Queen Mary exactly 10 years ago. He taught me on a module called Early Modern Theories of the State. He has once said in an interview that he prefers teaching in the seminar format compared with one-on-one supervisions. And that was really evident to us students. It was really evident to us students that he enjoyed teaching us in the seminar. It was clear that he regarded it as an enterprise of collective discovery and exploration, research-led teaching, to use their jargon. I think anyone who has been taught by Quentin and has had the experience of being led by him in the seminar room would agree that his way of creating a sense of purpose and excitement and energy in the room is second to none. We all sat in a circle with our blue books of Thomas More, Machiavelli and Hobbes, and we read aloud and analyzed passages together. That Quentin amazed us with his erudition and his eloquence and precision in conveying that erudition to our students will not come as a surprise to anyone here. But what was really inspirational and made him stand out in an already extremely impressive roster of teachers on the London MA in the history of political thought was his readiness to think creatively and laterally about political and philosophical arguments. And though he was not reluctant to relate the philosophical and political arguments we discussed to the present day and to modern politics, the main objective was always to think historically about the arguments. Seeing his exceptional historical and analytical mind at work and his ability to think on his feet on a weekly basis for an entire term was a privilege in the true sense of the word and something I will never forget. And as we all know, and as Oscar Wilde said, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So when some of us from the MA cohort went on to do PhDs and when we went on to teach, we all tried to copy Quentin shamelessly, and we borrowed all of his techniques. And we used him, of course, as our model. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank Quentin and emphasize how inspirational he has been for me and so many other students on the London MA. Both as a teacher and as a person, I should add. Thank you. But it is, of course, as a scholar, as a historian, and as a writer on method, and also as a political theorist, of course, in his own right, that most of us will know of Quentin. And that is now what I will move on to say something about. Because we have been asked by Andrew to address the future of intellectual history. Perhaps no one in our time has done more to shape our discipline than Quentin. The only person who would come close would probably be John Pocock. And I'm convinced that Quentin will continue to shape the future of our discipline for a long time to come, both, of course, through his own work, but also indirectly through the long-standing book series he has established, Ideas in Context and the Blue Books at Cambridge University Press, series that we all rely on so much, both in our research and our teaching. In a recently recorded interview with Rodri Lewis, Quentin said that a great deal of what he has tried to do in his career has been to revise the Whig history he was taught at school. Even though he stressed that his school education was both formative and formidable, he was taught a Whig narrative about the emancipation of the true-born British subject from tyranny during the English Revolution. And since then, Quentin has tried to find better answers to the questions that were raised during his school years. These remarks by Quentin have inspired the title of my short presentation today. So we often think of Peter Laslett as the starting point of the contextualist approach to the history of ideas that developed at Cambridge in the middle decades of the last century, and for which Quentin has become seen as the most prominent representative, even though we know that he does not prefer the term Cambridge School, and there are good reasons to avoid this term. But for the genealogy of the contextualist method, we are indebted to Pocock's autobiographical writings. And as we know, Pocock dates the genesis of the contextualist method to 1949 and 1950, when Pocock became aware of Laslett's path-breaking contextual work on Robert Filmer and John Locke. At the time, Pocock was supervised by Herbert Butterfield, who wrote a famous work entitled The Whig Interpretation of History, nearly a century ago. And the importance of this work for Pocock is something Samuel James has emphasized in a recent article, and to which Pocock responded with his characteristic critical age. So we can argue about Butterfield's importance and about his attack on Whig history, yet it is clear that Quentin, and most people who have written in Quentin's shadow and published in Ideas in Context and in the Blue Book series, are not Whig historians. At least not in a narrow sense of the term, in the sense of identifying a progressive thread and institutional continuity in British or English history. One American intellectual historian once asked me, what is considered worse in London and in Cambridge, to be a Whig historian or to be an antiquarian? I don't think it was meant as a serious question, but it was something I went on to think about. Because, of course, Whig history in a narrow, nationalistic sense is now as unfashionable as it can get. And because we are working in an academic world that is preoccupied with impact and relevance, it means that national history has become deeply unpopular. But there is one dimension of Whig history which has survived, I would argue, and that is Whig history in the broader sense, which is really what Butterfield was writing about. Whig history in the broader sense means writing history for the sake of the present, and indeed often pandering to passing prejudices. The difference now is that whereas once the past was seen as a cause of celebration, it is now viewed as being in need of condemnation. The only form of national history that is now acceptable is one that is as ideologically charged as the old Whig history, a history that seeks to indict the past for not living up to the dominant values of the present. In other words, history is still being moralized. And in order to think about why this may be a problem, we must return to Quentin's famous 1969 essay on the meaning and understanding in the history of ideas, and his other writings on methodology. And of course, Quentin would like us to go back to R.G. Collingwood's autobiography and other writings that inspired him. But Quentin's writings on methodology, among other things, argued that in order to understand the thinkers of the past, we need to recognize that past authors had their own questions, which are very often going to be different from ours, and the challenge is to see things their way. One thing which makes this kind of historical interpretation difficult is that history is not only something historians care about. The term history in English and in many other languages is an ambiguous term, as it denotes something that has happened, an event, for instance, in someone's life, as well as the activity and the craft of the historian. And for us today, it is crucial that these two meanings should not be confused. Almost everyone is interested in the past, and most people try to relate the present to the past and the past to the present, but most people are not historians. History in the specific academic sense is the activity of historians, who is concerned with what the philosopher Michael Oakeshott termed the historical past. A historical past is different from a practical past, which is what the moralist, the ideologue, the activist, and the advocate might be interested in. The practical past is a useful past, and a practical response to the past is a response of the partisan. The historical past, by contrast, is a dead past. It is neither memory nor common knowledge, but something that the historian must infer from surviving evidence. Knowledge about the historical past advances our historical knowledge. And when we are looking for any utility or relevance beyond this objective, we stray into a practical activity instead of following the logic of historical scholarship. Studying the past for the sake of the past means that the goal of historians is to advance historical scholarship rather than some political or social agenda. A historian does not look for a justification or a criticism of the present. So this is an ideal, but in reality, as we know, it is very different. So historians, and sometimes with problematic consequences, speak in many different voices, as cultural critics, as activists, as moralists, as advocates. But I think that most historians who think about the logic of their activity and their craft will realize that taking on this separate role is importantly an additional role, and that practical commitments can only distract from and will often distort rather than advance an historical inquiry, which is about asking historical questions and understanding an historical past. Understanding what Shakespeare, Machiavelli, and Hobbes were doing when writing something, what their intended meaning was, is surely the key historical question for many of us here today. But I believe that this distinction between a historical past and a practical past is more pertinent today than perhaps ever, or at least in a long time, as the historical profession is being challenged and undermined by various political forces. For example, efforts to change the curriculum to suit political taste in the present. Academic history, under pressure from funding bodies and administration and bureaucrats, is becoming increasingly redirected towards concerns that are meant to be ethical and useful, which often means replacing the historical past with a practical past, and usually an ideologically inflected past to boot. In intellectual history, scholars have referred to a moral or a normative turn, and of course Richard referred to this as well. The moral or normative turn in intellectual history might, of course, be understandable for many reasons. I mentioned the pressure from bureaucrats and funding bodies. Another reason is that the topics we are studying are becoming more and more modern. And it is more difficult, for obvious reasons, to study a more recent past and than a practical past, because than a more remote past, because a more recent past will provoke a practical interest in a way a more remote past may not. But whatever period we are studying, the nature of our subject and the fact that many of us are studying political topics will very often also provoke practical interests. For many, the opportunities unleashed by publicizing their own moral or political stance will be attractive and sometimes even irresistible. And I am neither oblivious nor complacent about these evident difficulties. And to be clear, I'm also open to the possibility and the benefit of different disciplines and activities engaging with each other in a conversational manner. And with the right signposting, it may also be possible and fruitful to blend certain activities within the same work. Quentin and Richard, of course, recently edited an excellent volume on this, on history and the humanities and social sciences. But at the same time, I do think that it would be a mistake not to recognize that this moral, normative, and practical turn poses profound challenges for the historical integrity of our discipline, which Quentin has done so much to establish. The increasingly common fallacy is to think that it is mere antiquarianism to wish to study the past for the sake of the past. Instead, this is the modern attitude towards historical scholarship, which replaced the earlier utilitarian version, which was common before the rise of scientific historical scholarship in the 19th century, associated with the Germans and especially Ranke. The idea that history is philosophy teaching by example is a very old idea. And when Lord Bolingbroke adopted this formula in the 18th century, he cited Dionysius of Halicarnassus as an ancient source. Indeed, the practical attitude towards the past, the evaluation of what has happened in relation to ourselves, may be as old as the human race. So we are here to celebrate Quentin, who set a model for generations of students in London, and of course elsewhere, but we're talking about London. And since we have been invited to reflect on the future of intellectual history, I think we need to be frank about the potential risks we face if we continue to go down the route of presentism, relevance, and impact. History has, of course, tangible benefits, and teaching people to think historically is profoundly valuable. But in trying to find out what the purpose of academic history is, we have perhaps become too willing and too eager to follow the practically minded and look for purposes that fall outside the remit of historical scholarship. In other words, we are increasingly willing to accept the old-fashioned view that the purpose of history is to contribute to moral and political causes, rather than recognizing its own distinct role. Thank you.
Thanks, Max. That was really challenging. Can you hear me? Because this has gone red. Okay, I'll just speak. Oh, it's green now. Have to shake it. So we have a bit of time for questions. We're going to break for tea at 4. So I'm going to hold you here until somebody asks a question. To either or both of the speakers. Yes. You can have my microphone, yes. Okay, good.
I think this is green. I'm fascinated by this dichotomy between philosophers rooted in the present, historians rooted in the past, and how we accommodate these two. Can I now, in front of you, with this microphone here, commit suicide? You probably haven't seen this done before, so if you're going to be shocked, you could well have your tea now. I speak metaphorically, but the distinction between the past and the present is surely one which can't now be sustained in the light of modern physics. Instead of time being linear, instead of time being cyclical, we are now urged to consider that space-time is a dimension, so that for any given point, for any given moment in time, all space is simultaneously present, and for any given point, any given moment in time. I'm mixing this up, you know what I mean, the other way around. Can it therefore be that we are doing what philosophers do when they insist that they are talking in the present, therefore they can't talk to us because we as historians are talking in the past? Should the bridge to be built be a bridge which invokes natural science in the present day and creates a different understanding of time?
Richard, I'll give you this.
I've connected my own.
You're still on? Right.
I've put it back on. I'm not sure if that's a question for me, actually, Jonathan. But I'll accept it as one for me.
Max.
I was making a sociological point about the division between disciplines. That's an institutional fact. People study philosophy, people study history. And I think there have been, and I think this is also an institutional fact, tensions between the pursuit of both. And I wanted to make the point that, therefore, with students with an interest in the history of philosophy, that can become fraught. And one of the contributions which Quentin made was to make it respectable to have an interest in the history of philosophy. So that's the simple point I was making. The wider ontological point about the relationship between the past and the present, I accept that there aren't distinct ecstasies of temporality that can be held apart. And I don't accept myself that philosophy is not also the study of the past. So I wouldn't want to buy into the attitudes or prejudices, if you like, that underpin the current intellectual division of labour across the humanities. But I would say it's a fact. But I think it's only a good thing to challenge it. So maybe that leaves us agreeing.
Max, do you have an answer to this?
Certainly not. No, I think the question was very yeah, I need to think more about that. Thank you, Jonathan.
Do we have other questions? Yes, right up the back of the theatre. Oh, I didn't see you. Yep.
Richard, thanks.
Paul.
You finished by saying, rather than everything maybe being power, there's the Hegel alternative. But you forgot to tell us what the Hegel alternative is. I'm aware it might not be possible to do that especially quickly, but it would be good for you to finish that rather than leaving us hanging. So maybe a few more minutes.
Well, yes, I'm all for with leaving hanging. I have I will have more to say about this in October when a book on the subject appears, but of course, a perfectly reasonable question. I think there's been a tendency to view historicism as putting the past in the past, which is, of course, correct. That's what it does. And therefore, at the same time, to not want to judge the past in any way. And that's, of course, understandable, because the judgment of the past is the application of alien norms to a foreign country. So all I would want to draw attention to is that Hegel accepted historicist principles, the world is not our world, but didn't accept the idea that that landed you with inter-civilizational relativism, that you didn't have to think that Egyptian despotism was equally valid as modern constitutional democracy. I don't either think that the ancient despotisms are as valid as modern constitutional democracy. So I was just attracted to, someone who was interested in, to come back to Jonathan's point, thinking that philosophy and history are coterminous pursuits. But that didn't leave us with a doctrine of radical incommensurability, such that, comment juger les autres. I think his own particular methods was for, if you like, explaining the normative purchase of one world as against another was a process of immanent criticism, which was looking at the dynamics by means of which one world view imploded on its own terms. So it's not, as it were, us afterwards sitting in judgment upon it, but it is us accepting that slave-owning societies failed and accepting that we can affirm that outcome normatively. So that's the direction of travel. I think that was also one for me, I'm afraid. So next question is for Max.
Yes, listen.
I have a question for Max. So I raised my hand a little higher. Sorry, I don't think we can see each other, basically, because of the camera. So I guess I have a few questions, the more constructive of which I think you can answer. The starting point is that you've spoken kind of generally about concerns about moralizing ethical practices, contemporary, present practices. And I'm wondering if you want to quantify that and say examples of what you're thinking about when you're concerned about that. And then secondly, whether we can, I mean, there's a concern that is what's happening in present society, and present academic practice. How do we decipher between those concerns and practices that I think model, what Quentin and others have said, which in terms of academic study, which is asking why people ask the questions that they do at particular moments in time, right? That's part of our practices. Why are these important? Why are people thinking the way they do? How do we decipher between that happening in our present, in the questions that we're asking, and a concern that people are moralizing about present topics?
Thank you. Is my microphone still on? Excellent. So both brilliant questions. Quantify, well, I rather not, but maybe I perhaps should. No, jokes aside, of course. So the first, to bring it back to the London years, so the first graduate conference in political thought I went to when I was an MA student in 2013, I think James Tully was the keynote speaker, and I think at one point at least he was an historian, of course, one of Quentin's students. He may be in philosophy now, so I might be. So I think he perhaps is in philosophy. But in any case, the takeaway point of his keynote, if I remember correctly, was sure, once upon a time in the 60s and 70s, historians could afford to historicize, but now we have climate change. So that's no longer relevant. So now it's time for historians to make a difference. So that's one example. So that's in 2013, and a book was published. Co-authored by someone I admire a great deal, David Armitage, The History Manifesto, a couple of years ago. A very provocative and important book in many ways, but I think was a book that made a case for why history could make a difference in present debates. At least that was one of the purposes of that book. So that's a bit of quantification for you. We can probably talk more about it afterwards. And then so those are two clear-cut examples, and then there are more grey areas, of course. In terms of the questions we're asking, so that's of course a very difficult question. So how do you distinct? How can you disentangle this? How can you? So I think in the activity of the historian. So I spoke about Michael Oakeshott in the talk. So to use one of his examples, so a cook for Oakeshott is not someone who has a vision about a pie and then cooks it. So the idea of the pie is springing from the practice. So I think that's something we should perhaps be more prepared to make allowance for. That the historical questions we're asking are actually not in the sense that Elton would say, that the material forces these questions upon us, but they are yet generated by our practice and our reading of the material, alongside, of course, the reading of the historiography and the historical scholarship. So I think a lot of the questions will come from there. And I think if we start to think too practically, and we start to look for the historical questions in the newspapers, in opinion pieces, which I don't think that you advocate at all. But if that's what that is the contrast. And I think when we look at how funding applications are formulated, they're not really made for the humanities. And when we are encouraged to think about impact, they don't mean impact on historical scholarship. They mean impact in society. Right, and I think if we have that, if that's what we are encouraged to do, that's going to, in some ways, distort the historian's practice. Thank you.
Right. There's a question up the back here and another one up the back there. We have about 2 minutes. So you need a microphone. Okay, I'll bring this one up.
That'll take 1 minute.
My question is not, can you hear me? I can't. My question is not addressed to any panelist in particular, but to, well, the entirety of the panel. I'm a final year undergraduate history student at UCL, and I've actually had the pleasure of being taught by some of the MA graduates, Dr. Adela Halo and Dr. Will Salinger. And I actually chose to specialize in intellectual history and history of political thought after being introduced to the discipline only at university level. And I've really liked the point of, I believe, I really like the point about how humanities at the moment are being jeopardized by more mathematical and data-based disciplines, especially for young professionals and aspiring academics. And I guess my question is that those who have been already immersed in the fields of intellectual history and history of political thought recognize its value in sustaining humanities, but how can we and how can intellectual historians as a group adopt strategies to help maybe bring out that value of intellectual history and history of political thought to a broader audience, so for example, high school students or college students, because I do feel like there's a lot of value in what industry professionals of history do at the moment. Thank you.
I'm not sure who that was for, but I have something to say about it just very quickly, which is there is a PhD graduate. He wasn't in my long list. My long list of people I felt was too long, but anyway, there's one, Conor Bollins, who did a PhD in this university and an MPhil in Cambridge, who has been teaching the history of political thought in schools in London. And there's no question but there's a very substantial appetite for that subject in schools. Of course, philosophy is taught in French schools, but not in this country. I think there's been a conspiracy. Is that too strong a word? There's been a tendency amongst historians to flee the kind of content that is taught by intellectual historians because it's not part of the standard formation. So, abstract cogitation or analytical refinement is a different mental operation from the equally valuable synthesis of great quantities of information and forming it into narrative structures. These are distinct mental operations, both fundamental to the humanities. My own preference is that anyone with a humanities education should have an education in both, but the post-50s development of historical study has militated against it, and schools have, therefore people taught in universities teach in schools that the power of universities to form social opinion is massive. The need for impact is zero. The impact has happened by the education of 45% of the population, and so on and so forth. But I'm sort of agreeing with your sentiment that, of course, there should be dissemination at school level, and I think it would be very popular. Not least of all, when I taught in this university, we taught intellectual history in the first year, and of course, students never taught intellectual. They thought it was being an intellectual or something, and were intimidated by it until they were taught, and it became very popular. Actually compulsory, but still popular. first year course, out of which many of our students went on to do MAs and then PhDs and so on and so forth. So I do think there's an appetite for it. I've not given too long an answer, but anyway, I agree with you.
That's great. Max, did you have anything you want to say about that? It's entirely up to you.
I think perhaps we're out of time, but I think, just in a word, of course, it would be great to roll it out more broadly. I think that Conor Bollins, I don't think he's here, but he has recently written material for history of political thought at A-levels. which looked very interesting as far as I could see. So I applaud that initiative. But at the same time, I think when we promote the history of political thought and intellectual history, as I said in my speech, I think we should be a little bit careful about making it too much about the practical past.
It's a great question. I actually just come back to the first question. I think it connects as well to the way in which we relate to other disciplines. I'm currently working with a large number of engineers, and it's quite eye-opening, the connections that you can make between history, political thought, and engineering, for example. It is time to have tea. We have about 25 minutes, and then we'll come back for the second session. Second session, we begin with Hannah Dawson. Hannah is a reader in the history of political thought at King's College, London. She did her BA, MPhil, and PhD at Cambridge, where she studied under Quentin. She's been teaching in the London MA in the history of political thought and intellectual history for many years. And one of her most recent publications is the brilliant Penguin book of feminist writing. If you haven't got it, I recommend that you do. Today, she will be speaking on neoromanism, feminism, and the future of the history of political thought. Hannah.
How's that in terms of audibility? Good, brilliant, excellent.
Much better than mine.
Good, sorry. Thank you so much, Andrew. Let me just put this in my pocket. When Quentin Skinner excavated the neo-Roman theory of liberty, according to which you are not free, indeed you are a slave, if you are subject to arbitrary power, regardless of the absence of actual interference, he opened up a vast resource to rival liberalism for understanding freedom. His empirical work more broadly, in irrepressible dialogue with his methodological and normative insights, I'm definitely taking a normative turn here, coalesces into a hermeneutics of oppression that illuminates texts which go far beyond his own original sites of genealogy, especially, as I will argue today, in relation to gender and also to race. On the face of it, this might seem like an odd claim, since many of the early modern writers who employed the neo-Roman theory to complain that they were slaves under absolute monarchy simultaneously endorsed either the subjection of women or the institution of chattel slavery. John Locke is a good example here because he does both. On the one hand, he explains that to be free is not to be under the will of another man, and that the mere fact of the absolute power of Charles II is an act of war against him, which turns him into a slave and legitimates armed revolution. On the other hand, he asserts that in the conjugal relation between husband and wife, where their two wills will unavoidably diverge and one must determine the other, the rule, he says, naturally falls to the man as the abler and the stronger of the two. And the fundamental constitutions of Carolina, in which Locke undoubtedly had at least a hand, states that every free man of Carolina shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves. Moreover, white women like Mary Astle, who point out the Whig hypocrisy in relation to women and ask if all men are born free, how is it that all women are born slaves, themselves ignore the human beings who are being trafficked across the Atlantic Ocean. Indeed, some feminists like Sarah Chapone argues in 1735 that English wives are in a worse condition than slavery itself. But what were blind spots for those with power were not blind spots for those living under it. And they drew deeply on the language of freedom that Skinner has enabled us to read. This discourse that Skinner exhumed sees liberty as a status of persons rather than, as he explains, a predicate of actions. If you are dependent on the will of another, if you live at their mercy, even if you are not constrained or coerced by them, even if you are left alone to do what you apparently want, then you are not free. Arbitrary power per se annuls your liberty, so there is no distinction between a king and a tyrant. There can be no such thing as a good king or a kind master. Both assault you, regardless of any virtue that they might possess. This theory saturates the writing of women and formerly enslaved people. Oluwado Equiano describes the overarching fact, regardless of all the other liberties that he is allowed, all the good treatment that he receives from his master, that he lives in a state of dependency, as he says, on him, and that the first natural right of mankind is equality and independency. Otova Koguano describes the enslavement of Africans by Great Britain as a tyranny. Frederick Douglass relates how his master told him, "If I would be happy," this is him, "I must lay out no plans for the future. If I behaved myself properly, he would take care of me. Indeed, he advised me to complete thoughtlessness of the future and taught me to depend solely upon him for happiness." Neo-Roman language also beats through early modern feminism. It is there in the French of Anne-Marie Louise d'Orléans, Duchesse de Montpensier, who inveighs against cette dépendance and condemns marriage as l'esclavage in the 1660s. And she dreams of a corner of the world where women might be their own maîtresse. The author of the 1739 text, Woman Not Inferior to Man, who wants to go by the name of Sophia, a person of quality, longs for the sweets of liberty and sighs that women are condemned to pass their whole lives in a state of subordination to the men, in an absolute dependence upon them, describing women's condition as abject slavery. Catherine Macaulay picks up precisely this phrase in her letter, No Characteristic Difference in Sex, wondering at the grim history of women that has reduced them to a state of, again, abject slavery, her words. Macaulay's great admirer, Mary Wollstonecraft, perceives the tyranny of man, the slavish dependence of women, and particularly the slavery of marriage. Mary Hayes, who in turn adored Wollstonecraft, wrote in her appeal to the men of Great Britain in behalf of women in 1798. She mused how it was that in Britain, the absolute abode of liberty, men whose ardent love of liberty was of such high importance to themselves, doomed women whom heaven having in its wisdom formed their equals to be slaves of man. The problem she identified was the absolute government of men over women, which is synonymous with tyranny. Absolute government constitutes, on this view, an intrinsic violation of its subjects. Arbitrary power, says Mary Astell, is evil in itself and an improper method of governing free and rational agents. Of course, she's partly tongue-in-cheek here, as she, a divine right Tory, is exposing Whigs' double standards. But she's also mesmerised by the way in which their theory fits the situation of married women like an iron glove. Chapone reflects on the fact that there is nothing in English law to stand between a husband and abuse except love. A wife's legal personhood and everything that she might be said to own being subsumed by her husband under the common law practice of coverture. A wife is in potestate maritorum. Even if her husband is benevolent, she may reflect, says Chapone, that she is in the condition of a slave. Women, she says, are unfree, even though the rod might not be held over their backs. Chapone relates the story of an unhappy wife who left her husband. Incensed, he asserted his right to control, and he declared that she had invaded his prerogative, and insisted that she come back to him. And she was dead, says Chapone, in less than a month. He had never beaten her, she says, nor threatened her life, though he took all other methods to break her heart. Living in a state of dependence, however nominally and ostensibly free one is to move and go about one's business, is hellish, they say, because it is precarious. It is hard to build a life on shifting sands, to construct a self when there is nothing fixed to hold on to feel calm when the tissue of trust is thin. This is why the figure of the capricious master and husband looms so large in the sources. Slaves, as Cogoano writes, are dealt with as their capricious owners may think fit. Mary Prince evinces the perpetual disorientation of being bought and sold, of leaving her nice mistress. I did not know where I was going, she writes, or what my new master would do with me. As Thomas Pringle elaborates for her, even when an enslaved person is favoured, their condition is still precarious, for it is every moment at the mercy of events and must always be held by a tenure uncertain. Equiano describes what it is like to be lulled into the false sense of security that a liberal master can afford, and then the crashing horror of the realization that it was all only ever a cruel illusion. His master had, he said, treated me always extremely well, and my attachment and gratitude to him were great. His kindness had cultivated in him an unbounded confidence, he says. He had played at marbles and bought white men a little sugar or tobacco with his winnings and believed that he was free. And then, one day, when they arrived in Deptford, his master forced him into a barge and said he was going to sell him. I was so struck with the unexpectedness of this proceeding, writes Equiano, that for some time I could not make a reply. Then he asked if he could at least fetch his books and clothes. But, I'm quoting, but he, my master, swore that I should not move out of his sight, and if I did, he would cut my throat. Douglas remembers the fear, the painful self-censorship of what it was like every day to wonder how the master's horses were, because if they were out of sorts, the master might take it out on his slaves. Everything, writes Douglas, depended upon the looks of the horses. The governance of a husband, says Mary Hayes, is guided by their own caprice. Even in the domestic sphere, where women might be thought to have some share in the management, their authority lies, she says, at the mercy of their husbands. Astell, again quoting Locke back at himself, explains how it is that the being subjected to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of men is the very definition of slavery. Without a standing rule to live by, under the empire of will rather than law, a woman can find no peace. A woman, concludes Astle, has in truth no security but the man's honour and good nature, which is no security at all. Any promises he makes are of little force, since the will of the sovereign is all in all. A husband may not harm his wife, he may leave her rights entirely intact, but he may, however, says Astle, do what is much more grievous to a generous mind, render life miserable. Living at the mercy of someone's will is diminishing, they say. To have to keep looking over your shoulder, to have to live in the weather of the person on whom you depend. Only the mighty are allowed to have bad moods. And as Astle says, perhaps the worst thing to bear in a husband is the disagreeableness of humours. Unregulated and unaccountable, he does not have to check his temper. It is like being, she says, in a continual plague, and for the most part incurable. Brought up as a little prince, and then head of the household, flattered and fawned over, never gainsayed, he comes to believe that he is too wise to be advised. And Astle does wonder at one point whether it might not be so bad to be subject to husbands if they weren't so stupid. Just as power naturally puffs up, she says, a man, and makes him full of himself and his endowments, so in inverse proportion does it lessen women. She must follow all his paces, she writes, and tread in all his unreasonable steps, or there is no peace, no quiet for her. She must obey with the greatest exactness. Men, she says, in an echo of the master-slave dialectic that Simone de Beauvoir will take up, are their own centres, while women lose their moorings. Given the structure of dependency, it becomes, as Wollstonecraft says, the mighty business of female life to please, and women pour themselves into making men feel good. Or, as the author who wants to go by the name of Jane Anger put it in 1589, speaking on behalf of we women, our good towards them, men, is the destruction of ourselves. The power dynamic not only enlarges the self at the expense of the other, but it corrupts both parties. While men become proud and conceited, women become obsessed with beauty, appearance, and false honour, and construct themselves as sexual objects, being the only thing of value in a man's world, competing with other women for the precious attention of men, and seeking the only power available to them through cunning and coquetry. And the regime runs deep, getting into women's very bones. The situation and education of women, writes Macaulay, is precisely that which must necessarily tend to corrupt and debilitate both the powers of mind and body. From a false notion of beauty and delicacy, their system of nerves is depraved before they come out of their nursery. As Wollstonecraft says, women make convenient slaves, but slavery will have its constant effect, degrading the master and the abject dependent. It is not just Skinner's empirical insights into the neo-Roman theory that expedite our reading of oppression, but so much else in his extraordinary oeuvre. His appreciation of Wittgenstein's dictum that words are deeds, and Austin's view of speech as action, his interest in the rhetorical vision of words as weapons and paradiastolic redescription as a way of manipulating and remaking social reality, his account of the intricate relationship between concepts and power and the contingency of those concepts, his presentation of universal truths that are so often merely local prejudices. his understanding of the use of texts in legitimating and constituting and changing the world. All these gesture at how freedom is not reducible to the idea of a person simply being able to act as she wants. They point to the ways in which speech and regimes of truth can do a kind of cumulative violence, as Jane Anger intimates when she relates how men snarl and bark out their reason. How a person can be boxed in by stereotypes and find no good place in the double binds of a discourse, as Sor Juana de la Cruz unpacks when she explains how a woman is ungrateful if she rejects a man and a whore if she submits. How a person's mental horizon can be limited, how she can believe that she is inferior, how what she wants is itself shaped by hegemonic norms, how the choices that she is free to make might themselves be constrained by silent structural forces, given that, as Astle puts it, men make worlds and ruin them, form systems of universal nature and dispute eternally about them, and all that the wise man pronounces is an oracle. The picture of oppression that Skinner paints is a profoundly internalized one. It does not, as it were, sit on top of a person, but resides inside them, which prompts the final issue that I'd like to raise, which is about the psychology of unfreedom. Skinner opens up this terrain when he probes the case of the happy slave, the state of false consciousness, and the view found in some sources that you do not have to know that you are a slave in order to be a slave. The women, for example, as Wollstonecraft puts it, who hug their chains and fawn like a spaniel. But sometimes the sources suggest that the experience of unfreedom is integral to its definition, that the fear, the uncertainty, the first-person knowledge are part of what it means to be a slave. As Douglas says, it was a most painful situation, and to understand it, one needs to experience it or imagine oneself in similar circumstances. Apologists for chattel slavery often claimed that physical chains were not as bad as mental ones, which not only carries the suggestion that the mind might be insulated from the world, but also that those in physical chains don't have minds to enslave. While Wollstonecraft was an abolitionist, she explicitly compares the abominable traffic of Africans to the more specious slavery of women, of white women, which is distinctive insofar as it chains the very soul. When formerly enslaved people told their stories in the form of autobiographical narratives and laid bare the agonies of their hearts and minds, they were demonstrating their humanity, but they were also arguing for a particular form of epistemic authority and testifying to the ways in which the horrors of chattel slavery went beyond physical chains. I have been a slave, says Mary Prince, in refutation of the argument that slaves do not want to be free. I know what slaves feel. I would like to end on a personal note. Just as Quentin articulates a capacious view of unfreedom in his work, he somehow manages to promote a capacious sense of freedom in his relationships with colleagues. Quentin is an incredibly distinguished person. He was my PhD supervisor, but the word that I keep coming back to when I try to describe what it was like being taught by him is emancipatory. Thank you, and thank you, Quentin.
Sorry, I'm just waiting for this to do something. Can you hear me all right? At the back, yeah? Okay, I'll just speak loudly. Oh, yeah. I've got green, there we go. Okay. Thank you, Hannah. Okay, our next speaker is Emily Steinhauer, who is a lecturer at Royal Holloway, University of London. She was a student in the London MA in the history of political thought and intellectual history, and she recently completed her PhD at Queen Mary. Her current research concerns how preconceived notions of intellectuals and intellectual labour impacted the opportunities for women in early 20th century research communities. Today, she'll be speaking on impossibilities of women's intellectual history.
Thank you. I feel I have to also ask, is my microphone on? Now, I can't, of course, follow up what Hannah said. I don't have such a close personal connection, and it always feels funny as a 20th century historian to come into these events. It's somewhat anxiety-inducing, but maybe it's also very freeing. Maybe you can sort of freely associate a bit more, and that's what I'm trying to do today. Now, I think the principle or the founding works in any field are a bit like the foundation stones in medieval cathedrals. They are the bedrock of an edifice that grows over time, but they also give creative license to later generations of craftspeople. And I think intellectual history is no exception. Time and time again, we return to the methodological and theoretical classics, to our bedrocks, to reorientate ourselves as the historiographical landscape changes around us. And as we add our chapels and turrets to this collective cathedral that we're building, we are also safe in the knowledge that we are building on firm ground. And I think today is particularly about reflecting on this, to consider the sometimes hidden, sometimes visible parameters that ground our own work and that provide fertile soil for new thought to grow. Now, therefore, I think these celebratory events are always also strange affairs, because they are as much about the foundations as they are about the vibrancy and the dynamism of the field that they build on and that they enabled. Now, I want to come back, therefore, to one of Quentin's texts and one of the first texts in intellectual history that I actually read when I started the MA here, and I want to use a particular quote to begin my talk with, and I hope it will ground it a bit. To understand any serious utterance, we need to grasp not merely the meaning of what is said, but at the same time the intended force with which the utterance is issued. We need, that is, to grasp not merely what past thinkers have said, but also what they are doing in saying it. And I think that is a quote that stayed with me for the many years that I have practiced intellectual history now, and it is a quote that is particularly with me as I started a new project on women's intellectual history. And that's the particular area of innovation or of new thought in intellectual history that I want to focus on today, this current increase or resurgence on work in one way or another, on this constellation of women and or women in intellectual history. So in particular, over the last few years, I think we've seen an increase or a resurgence in thought about women and intellectual history. And there's been a new spate of publications focusing on anything from gender in the Renaissance Commonwealth to Mary Wollstonecraft to transnational women in transnational thought. But I think we can also see that there is a clear moment of reconsideration or reconfiguration in the field where people are starting to consider, well, where are we going with this? What are we doing with this? What is the shape that this new subfield should actually take. And I think we're beyond the stage where we are simply adding women to a preconceived canon or rediscovering figures that should be considered. We're actually at a stage where we need to think more clearly about what we want to do with all of this new material on our hands. And therefore, I don't want to simply give you an overview of what women intellectual history and women intellectual historians have been trying to do over the last few years. I think the field by now is too large, but also too eclectic, too vibrant to squeeze that into 20 minutes. Instead, I want to connect to my earlier point concerning the foundations of our shared interest in the history of political thought, with some observations or maybe some problematizations regarding the development of women's intellectual history as a quickly accelerating stream of research, drawing on my own experience practicing women's intellectual history and the methodological questions that arise from it. And one of the most interesting questions within this is, I think, what do we actually mean by women's intellectual history? And how can we go beyond this exercise in adding different voices to the canon? Where do we recognize the limitations of such a process? Now, part of what I want to argue today is that focusing on women's intellectual history, and specifically the production of thought by women, tells us something new about the processes of intellectual labor, and specifically the transformation of thought as it leaves the confines of the private mind and enters a larger public sphere of intellectual self-fashioning. And here, I think, we need to intervene and we need to consider a bit more what we demand as intellectual historians and we demand as historians of intellectual women, and what these women themselves wanted, what their intentions were in writing certain texts and producing thought. And this is, I think, why I prefigured my talk today with Quentin's quote from one of his most foundational texts, because it reminds us of the rigor to take serious our historical subjects and not to impose what we want on them, what we think they should have said. Now, I am going to start with one presupposition, though, and that is that we are working and that we are thinking in a heavily gendered world. But this genderedness of our environment, of our intellectual environments, does not necessarily need to correspond to our own gendered self-understanding. But it is something that we recognize, that we work with, whether that's explicit or implicit. And that's what our historical subjects do as well. Okay, let me get back to Quentin Skinner himself. Because I want to also use this as an opportunity to show how we as 20th century historians can still draw on our colleagues in other fields and how they inspire us beyond the narrow confines of periodization. Now, a few years ago, I attended a lecture by Quentin. Unfortunately, I cannot quite remember the exact date, but it was in connection with the publication of his work on Shakespeare and the wide-ranging material that Shakespeare used to build some of his most famous plays. And as part of this discussion, the famous trial scene in The Merchant of Venice also came up. You might know it, otherwise I, of course, encourage you to go back to it. It comes quite far to the end of the play. Now, unsurprisingly, this scene was discussed because it's important for our understanding of Shakespeare and the judicial arguments that he draws on and that he explores. But something else in that scene stayed with me and kind of played on my mind over the subsequent years. Something I never quite knew how to place or what exactly to do with until I started a project on 20th century women sociologists, when it suddenly came back to me. Now, what you might rightly ask connects a Shakespearean courtroom drama with German interwar sociologists. And before I make you all kind of guess at the strange workings of my mind, let me provide an answer myself. In The Merchant of Venice, the climactic ending of the play sees Portia, a young heiress, take on the role of doctor of law, and she resolves a legalistic conundrum that could have almost cost Venetian merchant Antonio his life at the hands of the Jewish moneylender Shylock. Okay, this is a red herring now, because you could now all say, oh, it's anti-Semitism, because that's not only what Shylock might have experienced, it's actually also what a lot of these German interwar sociologists labored under. But that might be something for another day. It is actually the fact that Portia carries the day dressed up as a man. Only in disguise, equipped with a letter of recommendation from another lawyer to add to this, can she command the court and intervene in proceedings, first with the famous speech on mercy, and then with her reasoning on the fulfillment of Shylock's contract, which ultimately prevents Antonio's death. Now, Portia, although she's a made-up character in a play, in fact does what countless other women have done over the centuries. She has adopted a particular habitus as an intellectual, as someone presenting ideas in public in order to be heard. Now, if we fast forward a few hundred years, we don't necessarily see women dress up as men anymore to get a hearing. I'm here in my normal clothes today. But posturing as males certainly remains a tactic to give credence to your own ideas. And this, of course, goes back to my previous argument that we do indeed live in a world that is gendered, but that we also understand and that we can adopt to or adapt to. So we can, I as a woman could perhaps take on some of these more male-coded characteristics and use them to succeed. Now, by the 20th century, women intellectuals were not necessarily in a position where they actively had to pretend to be men to be heard at all. But the discarding of fake names or costumes did not mean that they were no longer laboring under false pretenses, as the psychoanalytical literature of the time shows, for example. And when I read those texts, it was that this play suddenly came back to me. Aptly titled Womanliness as Masquerade, British psychoanalyst Joan Riviere's piece from 1929 explores exactly these contortions women went through when acting as intellectuals in the public eye. Her text focuses on the particular case of a woman who had achieved the still relatively rare feat of making a name for herself academically, gaining reputation and acceptance among her peers. Yet it seemed that in her private life, she was compensating this with an overtly female personality, one that seemed to emphasize womanly characteristics to a pathological extent. The explanation offered by psychoanalysts at the time was that she was compensating with this womanly masquerade the male behavior she was putting on to guarantee her academic success. Now, how serious should we take this? And what then, if we do, are the implications for our work in women's intellectual history? Now, this episode reminded me of a study in the sociology of knowledge I had read roughly at the same time. Viola Klein, in her book, The Feminine Character, undertakes a study into the works of numerous sociologists and psychoanalysts who had written in one way or another on women and the way their character presented in the 19th and 20th century society. And she did this as one of the first PhD students of Karl Mannheim in his LSE exile in the 1940s. Now, in some ways, the title of the study and its author seem to suggest a very clear categorization of this as women's intellectual history. It's a woman writing on women. But when I read Klein's text, I was struck by her particular tone, the way she was phrasing her arguments, the way she was taking herself out of the book almost completely. If you did not know the title of the book, you wouldn't know really that a woman had written this, because she is so keen to obliterate any reference to her own identity within this text. Now, this is supported by Karl Mannheim in his preface, where he supports this idea that really this is not a text about women at all. It's actually a text about methodology. It's a text about the sociology of knowledge. Women, well, that's incidental, because she could have actually written this about anti-Semitism, and it would have been pretty much the same book. Now, reading that really struck me, because she was putting in such an effort to not write about women in a way, to not appear as a woman intellectual writing this. And it's particularly striking if you compare it to her work in the 1950s that she undertook with Alva Myrdal, the Swedish intellectual and Nobel laureate, also on women in modern society. Now, the tone here is very different. The way the two really put themselves as women intellectuals into the text. It fulfills, in a way, our expectations of what they should be doing as women intellectuals much more. Now, we can't understand, I think, what Klein is doing in the 1940s if we don't understand also her intention of sounding, of expressing herself as a male intellectual. And then we can see the changes that occur, the way that she maybe becomes more comfortable, or the way that she simply changes her attitude to the way that she wants to appear. Now, this explanation, or these two examples, are mirrored by a lot of the scholarly literature engaging with these women intellectuals and their male counterparts at the time. Whilst there is a recognition for the improvement of material conditions for women intellectuals, opportunities to publish, to attend university, and to follow through with scholarly careers, this is also undeniably a man's world, with significant consequences for any woman trying to become part of it. So to what extent, we must ask ourselves, are women forced to intellectually assimilate to male habitus of thinking? And why does that matter? And this brings me back to the question I posed at the beginning. What is women's intellectual history, actually? And I think one of the problems that such a clear separation into intellectual history on the one side, and then women's intellectual history, some might say a bit nastily as a sort of aborted appendix or some sort of strange subcategory, what this creates is a sort of presupposed neat parceling off of a particular subgroup of thought and thinkers. And it creates a division between a wider field and the specific field, which comes then with its own idiosyncrasies. And I think we are in danger of overplaying these specificities of women's intellectual history, these idiosyncrasies, in comparison to wider intellectual history. And by that I mean that we are supposing a kind of harmony or unity within this field of women's intellectual history. But in fact, there are myriad ways of thinking as a woman, of different intentions behind the way that we present our thought. And I think the example of Klein has shown that quite well. Now, at the heart of this really is the question, what happens to the author once they put pen to paper, or once they step in front of a lecture audience? So once they start to voice thought for an audience, how are they transformed? And why does this transformation matter to us as intellectual historians? So think of Portia, for example. Does it matter that she speaks as a man? Under her costume, she is still a woman. She has presumably formed these thoughts in a different environment. Is her thought, though, affected by this? Now, if we follow arguments made increasingly by historians now, in the 20th or in the 21st century, the way that she expresses her thoughts, the way that she chooses certain concepts, certain ideas, and not others, so what she omisses, what is omitted as much as what is said, does matter. What are her intentions making particular statements? They are surely about expressing certain contents, certain ideas, and transferring them, but they are also about making her role more believable, increasing her authority as a speaker. How do we understand authorship then in a world where intellectual labor is presumably so heavily gendered? And that does take me back to the quote that I read out to you at the beginning, the imperative that we need to take serious the imperative that if we want to take serious any utterance, we need to consider what people in the past were doing in saying something. Now, the original intention behind that essay was, of course, not necessarily women's intellectual history as such. But I think it does alert us to take serious that women in the past might have had their own intentions in taking on a particular gendered role. And it, I think, alerts us to the fact that we need to take them serious on their own and not impose our own demands on this. Now, I think recognizing this can be hugely frustrating. Many of us have come to the field of women's intellectual history because they did recognize a clear imbalance, a true neglect of people and ideas. But at the same time, I think that this insistence on nuance, this particular rigor, this acceptance of a particular context that shapes people and that creates particular personae, on reading these women on their own terms can also open the doors for further investigation. Acknowledging women's efforts to fit should not only alert us to their own intellectual journeys, but it also tells us more of the contextual parameters of intellectual work as such. If their work was often beset by intentional performance, should we not return to other canonical texts and consider the roles played within them? At the same time, disentangling the multi-layeredness of women's thought should also make us more alert to the processes of thought formation as well as alternatives of intellectual expression. And this is maybe where we can then redeem ourselves rather than our subjects. What are the sources, the networks, the contexts in which alternatives were possible, in which alternatives were voiced? Where can we find thought undressed? So we must ask how gendered are these concepts that we are working with, and where are maybe the sources, the places where we find other ideas? So are there other spheres of discourse where we can find those expressed? Are there archives, are there sources that we can in the end turn to? So I think by being more rigorous and by going back to these foundational texts and really taking serious what they can teach us about intellectual history, we, I think, can take more serious our own work as intellectual historians and find serious alternatives to the way that we practice intellectual history.
We have a couple of minutes for questions. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's surely a testament to the breadth of Quentin's influence that over the course of the two panels we've had so far, we almost seem to have heard about two different Quentin Skinners. One whose work is more historicist, one whose work has powerful normative impact, one who's interested primarily in what Max has called the historical past, and one who is also interested in the practical past. One who is providing intellectual resources to emancipatory movements, and one whose legacy is threatened by activist history. So my somewhat provocative question, which is perhaps unfair to only ask one of the panels, is, which Quentin Skinner is real?
I think this is a question for the panel. So,
I mean, it's a good question in relation to the panels. It's not a fair question in relation to. I mean, we can't speak for Quentin clearly, but I mean, I feel like as I read Quentin Skinner, there is an interest in absolutely doing the historical work. But increasingly, recently, there's an avowal that part of the kind of interest in doing that work is to see what comes up, and that to rediscover this neo-Roman theory of liberty is to add to the riches with which we can think now, normatively. I mean, I think it's also important to make a distinction between, it seems like there are two kinds of senses of normative going on here. On one hand, there's a sort of idea of like changing the curriculum, which Max was talking about. It seems to me I'm kind of unproblematic to say that we should just study women, and if that's a kind of normative turn, I mean, that seems unproblematic to me, uncontroversial. Clearly we should study women as well as male writers. And then there's another question, which goes to sort of Richard's paper, which is this question about the foundations of morality, and God knows what they are. I mean, it's that obviously, and Quentin's not interested in answering that question either. But what is striking is that there is a way in which the disciplines of history, or the method of history, is not completely insulated from kind of normative thinking. And that there's something that happens very interestingly and productively in doing historical work, doing the kind of deep historical work, not just that throws up theories that we haven't seen before, but as it were, gets our kind of normative neurons firing. And I think that one can understand, I think that one can start to sort of grasp things in a deeper normative way by doing history. Anyway, I'm sorry, Quentin, that you can speak for yourself.
Emily, do you want to answer that?
Yeah,
and then I think we'll take that one question and then we'll switch to the last panel.
I mean, just very briefly, maybe again as a 20th century historian, maybe I have to break it to you, you're in the public domain now, and everyone probably will make of you and your work what they want, and you probably can't, I don't know, always defend yourself against this. That is probably the sort of one downside of being such an influential intellectual figure. And I mean, I'm reluctant to say that we can or we should all do that. At the same time, I think what again I, as a sort of 20th century historian, have taken, well, for myself and from the years that I've been here, but also from all the papers today, is that in fact there is something for everyone in this. There is something for 20th century historians in this, and there is something for people with very particular questions. But then I think this goes back to a question that we have had earlier. There's also something very much for people just starting out in the field, and I think that is maybe one of the main takeaways from today. There's this sort of Quentin Skinner for every phase of our lives.
Okay, we should really end there, I think. Okay, thank you both. We have to rush on. Katie, we need to get a microphone on you, and we'll have about a 30-second pause while we switch microphones. Thank you. Okay, let's move on. Obviously, we're going to go past 6 o'clock, but we'll manage to fit in a drink later on. So our next speaker and our next panel. So we're moving on to the final panel on well, let's call it now Quentin Skinner and literature. We're beginning with Katie Edna-Landy, who was a PhD student of Quentin's at Queen Mary. She completed just last year in 2022. I remember I was there. And she has subsequently been elected to the Society of Fellows at Harvard University, where she's working currently on 2 book projects, including Ethical Icons, Sketching Character in Early Modern Europe, which is under contract with Harvard University Press. Today she'll be speaking on contextualizing Quentin Skinner's style.
Okay, mic should be on. Does that sound good? Great, all right. The formatting's a bit weird, but it should hopefully clarify as time goes on. So thank you so much to Andrew for organising this event and for this very kind invitation. I'm so delighted to be here and to attempt to offer something in honour and celebration of my wonderful doctoral supervisor, Quentin Skinner, and the years he spent at Queen Mary. So what I'd like to focus on today is how we might characterise Skinner's research as having 2 different nodes of focus. The first node is methodological. It comprises of Quentin's series of path-breaking articles begun in the late 1960s on the practice of history. These were philosophical pieces that used ideas from the philosophy of language, above all from Wittgenstein and from J.L. Austin, to inform the question of how to write history. They encouraged us to take seriously Wittgenstein's idea that words are also deeds. That to understand a word, we do not only need to understand its semantic meaning, but to look at what its speaker was trying to do with it. The second node of Quentin's work is rhetorical. It comprises of a number of books on the rhetorical culture of the Renaissance. These books illustrate how the Roman tradition of instructing rhetoric became a central part of early modern humanist education. Quentin's focus on rhetoric began with his 1978 Foundations of Modern Political Thought and has extended all the way through to his recent Forensic Shakespeare and From Humanism to Hobbes. Now, what I want to do in this brief talk is to observe the way in which these 2 nodes are related, the methodological and the rhetorical. This is just sliding. I'm going to put it here. What is rhetoric, we might ask, if not the study of how to make words do things, how to make words convince, persuade, please, and impress? Quentin himself has spoken many times about how he works to practice what he preaches, how he applies his philosophical method to the materials he studies, including the rhetorical culture of the Renaissance. Rhetorical culture of the Renaissance, exactly. So what I want to do here is flip this somewhat. Instead of asking how Quentin's method informs his materials, I'm going to look at how his rhetorical material informs the writing of his method. Rather than focusing on the content of Quentin's methodological arguments, this talk is going to take a closer look at their rhetorical form. I hope this literary analysis of a historian will be a fitting tribute for Quentin's London years. In this period, Quentin has held a chair in the humanities. This is a position that he has said liberated him from the need to uphold his professional identity as a historian of political thought. At Queen Mary, literature has taken on a central role in Skinner's work. He has written about drama and poetry and co-supervised a number of students with the School of English, myself included. But this proximity between literature and political thought is something that can already be found in Quentin's 1996 book, Reason and Rhetoric in the Philosophy of Hobbes. Here, Quentin affirms, and I quote, "how much we still need to learn as historians of philosophy from the disciplines of literary history and literary criticism." So to try to contextualize Skinner's style, I'm going to begin by examining Skinner's own rhetorical training via a peek into his school years. Then I'm going to skip all the way to 96 and home in on the methodological article Skinner wrote just after the publication of Reason and Rhetoric. Finally, I'm going to ask what Skinner's own style was doing, whether it can be seen as an intervention into a pre-existing debate. I'll conclude with a thought about the legacy that this style leaves the future of intellectual history. So part one, a renaissance of rhetoric. As probably many people in the room know, Quentin opens his major studies of Shakespeare and Hobbes with an account of their schooling. So I thought we might do something similar here and open a study of Skinner's style with an account of his early intellectual formation. Quentin's education, similar actually to the schooling of Shakespeare and Hobbes, took place in a school founded in the mid-16th century. In a 2008 interview, Quentin described how this was a very classical, traditional education, which involved studying classics from prep school, then history and English literature. Though I didn't get very far, when I spoke to Bedford School to try to get some more precise details about the 1950s curriculum, they did tell me some wonderful things about Skinner's extracurricular activities. So these give a sense of the role that both poetry and persuasion played in his early education. Quentin is looking terrified. So at school, Quentin was the convener of the Mitre Club, a debating society. In one session, when he was 17, he read a paper entitled Bunk, which was an examination of the nature of history. In the prescient words of the school magazine, for Quentin, it was a matter of major importance to try to discover a philosophy of history. Quentin had just been introduced to questions about historical interpretation in the work of the historian R.G. Collingwood via a brilliant history teacher who Quentin says was passionate about poetry and literature. This teacher's passions for poetry and literature may have informed one of Quentin's other extracurricular activities. So he was secretary of the Poetry Club and often wrote sonnets. Quentin's sonnets were often intertextual, borrowing lines from other poets, incorporating puns, such as the satirical mock and roll, and sometimes containing cryptographical references to his own name. The sonnets were remarkable, as the school magazine puts it, for their technical achievement. Quentin's interest in literary technique, satire, and persuasion all continue into his own writing. Okay, so we're moving on forward. Quentin, you look so worried. So I'm going to take us all the way now to 96, where Quentin, now chair in modern history at Cambridge, published Reason and Rhetoric. So this is a book profoundly interested, as most of us know here, in the question of style. In it, Quentin argues that Hobbes' style went through three major transformations, and that these transformations can be seen as interventions into broader debates about the nature of civil science. In his early career, Hobbes was an exceptional humanist, translating Thucydides and Aristotle and imitating classical poetry. In his mid-career, Hobbes then rejected the art of eloquence in order to develop a formal civil science of politics. In his later writings, especially Leviathan, Hobbes attempted to find some middle ground, having realized that he needed the techniques of rhetoric if civil science was going to be persuasive. But this final synthesized style that Hobbes develops Quentin says, is one of his most enduring legacies. With it, Hobbes taught philosophy a particular tone of voice, in which it continues to be spoken in the contemporary. It is a voice that combines an unanswerable blend of civilized satire and unimpeachable rationality. And this voice can be found in the work of Adam Smith, David Hume, and Bertrand Russell. But this voice can also be found, I think, in the work of Quentin himself. So we can start to observe this if we take as an example Quentin's article, Sir Geoffrey Elton and the Practice of History, also written in 1996. This is a caustic review of 3 books by Elton on the method of writing history. If we place the two side by side, we can find 3 rhetorical techniques that prove to be highly popular with both authors. They are the master trope of metaphor, the mocking technique of astismus, or using words ambiguously, astismus, ambiguity, and the figure of dubitatio, of a speaker feigning doubt. And I'll come to examples of these. All 3 figures are part of the classical rhetorical technique of ornatus, or ornament. This is the part of rhetoric which concerns the use of literary figures or tropes. So let's begin with that first one, with the presence of metaphor in both Quentin and Hobbes. Metaphor, Quentin explains, was the key trope recommended by Renaissance rhetoricians to pour scorn on one's adversaries by transforming them from bearers of respect into subjects of ridicule. Hobbes' Leviathan uses metaphor in this way to criticize the papacy. The papacy, Hobbes writes, is no other than the ghost of the deceased Roman Empire. Rather than being the revered head of the Catholic Church, the papacy is made into something without substance, a vacuity like a ghost, which should not inspire in us any reverence. Hobbes mocks the papacy in a similar way to his other clerical opponents, whom he transforms from devotional leaders into unskillful conjurers. So Quentin's article similarly uses metaphor as a vehicle for contempt. Not unlike Hobbes, Skinner turns his adversary, Sir Geoffrey Elton, from a master of his craft into a dogmatic prophet. Quentin does this by picking up on one of Elton's own metaphors. Elton imagines that the young historian is like an apprentice carpenter, perfecting their craft of finding historical facts by following an accomplished artisan. Where Elton uses the language of craftsmanship to describe the instruction of history, Quentin decides to shift things into a religious key. Quentin writes how Elton demands unswerving allegiance to the cult of the fact, transforming the historical fact into a religion that the acolyte must follow. Quentin extends this image by describing how Elton gnomically intones that the cult of the fact will guide the apprentice towards a final truth. So for both Quentin and for Hobbes, these metaphors prove incredibly useful in diminishing their adversaries, transforming them into cult leaders, amateur magicians, or insubstantial vacuities. Alongside satirizing their opponents through extended metaphor, Skinner and Hobbes both enjoy the technique of astismus, the art of using words ambiguously. Hobbes uses astismus, or ambiguity, when he describes school divines as ghostly. This is an instance of astismus because ghostly did not only mean insubstantial or unreal, but also devout. So Hobbes' readers might first approach his phrase, ghostly fathers, with the idea that it meant devout fathers, only to receive a rude shock as it became clear that Hobbes was using it mockingly. So Quentin uses astismus to a similar end. We see this in how he frames Elton's arguments as spectacular, a word that connotes something that is unreal and overblown, a spectacle, as well as something that is striking. Quentin also uses astismus, and we do this in English all the time, especially at occasions like these, when describing Elton's response to an objection as interesting. A final figure popular with both Hobbes and Quentin is dubitatio, the performance of mock innocence, of disingenuous or dubious doubt, of making people believe that we are not sure of what we are saying. Hobbes manipulates dubitatio with phrases like, I know not how this so manifest a truth should of late be so little observed. Quentin also delights in this rhetorical technique. He does so by beginning paragraphs with a mild-mannered, I am not sure, I suppose, it might be supposed, or, as shown here, I am not altogether sure. So it is through vivid metaphor and tropes that Quentin thus embellishes his arguments, just as Hobbes does in his Leviathan, through, we might say, combining a kind of civilized satire with unimpeachable rationality, a way of using the techniques of poetry to be maximally persuasive. Quentin's use of rhetorical techniques is not, however, isolated to this one article. Rather, some of his most widely known ideas also turn out to be rhetorical devices. So take the claim in Liberty Before Liberalism that the intellectual historian is a kind of archaeologist. bringing buried intellectual treasure back to the surface. This is, of course, another extended metaphor. Consider how Quentin is punning, and remember mock and roll, when he says that the pen is a mighty sword. This is also another extended metaphor, as it continues Skinner's earlier discussion that neither the historian nor the philosopher can stand above the battle because the battle is all there is. Finally, observe how, when in Meaning and Understanding, Quentin decides to classify the writings of his opponents not as histories, but more appropriately as mythologies, he's carrying out a clever act of rhetorical redescription. The classical technique of framing a virtuous act, writing history, as a more dubious act, obscuring readers by proffering mythologies. Across his works, Quentin, like Hobbes, then uses ornatus to coin some of his key concepts. But this should perhaps not be surprising to us. Ornatus, in classical Latin, the art of adorning one's speech with figures, is ordinarily used to describe someone armed with weapons for war. As Quintilian puts it, the orator, whose speech is ornatus, holds a flashing sword that brings terror to the eye. As we saw with Quentin's metaphor of the pen being a mighty sword, Skinner often uses the language of battle to describe the history of ideas. Concepts, he says, are best imagined as weapons of ideological debate. To most effectively deploy his own concepts, his own verbal weaponry, Quentin accordingly uses figurative language. So this brings us on to part 3, fashioning philosophy, to answer the question of what the presence of eloquence in Skinner's methodological work might be doing, and to ask about its legacy. Is Quentin's style simply a contingent feature of his immersion in rhetoric, from his early education all the way through his professional career? Or might his style be seen as a kind of intervention into pre-existing debates? To answer this, one thing we might want to first underline is that in the 1990s, there were major debates about the style of philosophy, about whether philosophy should be seen as an art or as a science, with deconstructionists on the one side and positivists on the other. Quentin himself was no stranger to these discussions. In fact, he co-edited a volume with one of the major players in this debate, the philosopher Richard Rorty, which grapples with some of its questions. In the introduction to this volume, Quentin and his co-editors Rorty and J.B. Schnurend argue against positivists who think that the only fitting conversational partners for philosophers are scientists. Their volume, the editors say, considers not only the connections between Kant and the physicist Hermann von Helmholtz, but Kant and the French poet Paul Valéry. Given Quentin's aim to place the history of philosophy in dialogue with both the history of the arts and the sciences, might we then ask whether Quentin's own writing style enacts this same desire, a desire to find inspiration from both literary works and scientific treatises, to be at once rhetorical and deductive, at once a civilized satire and a work of unimpeachable rationality. Quentin's writing, by combining rhetorical figures and clear reasoning, would then stand at a midpoint, somewhere between the arts and the sciences, between the poet and the physicist, in a position in which he would also place Thomas Hobbes. So this brings us to finally ask what legacy this mixed style leaves for the future of intellectual history. I'd like to close by offering one thought. So this takes us back to R.G. Collingwood and to Quentin's young aspiration to find a philosophy of history. In his autobiography, Collingwood writes that his life's work hitherto, as seen from his 50th year, has been in the main an attempt to bring about a rapprochement between philosophy and history. Quentin's work, as seen from his 82nd year, if I may, has long completed this same task, which he set himself at 17. But Quentin has also brought about a different kind of rapprochement, one between literature and history. This rapprochement has both encouraged historians to take an author's choice of literary devices seriously, to look for what rhetorical figures are doing in Hobbes's Leviathan. It has also encouraged literary scholars to contextualize their units of analysis, to analyze Shakespeare, for example, through the prism of the rhetorical figures he would have known. In its style, Quentin's work may have further offered us something else, a model of writing intellectual history that does not shy away from acknowledging the power of excellent prose, of prose that pairs clear reasoning with eloquent figures, that recognizes the persuasive power of poetry. For the future, it offers an exhortation that the intellectual historian must be at once orator, artist, and civil scientist if they are to be effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Your archival skills were worthy Elton himself. That was very entertaining as well as fascinating. Our next speaker is Angus Gowland. Angus is a professor of intellectual history at UCL. With Richard Burke and Georgios Varoufakis, he helped create the London MA in the history of political thought and intellectual history. He is the UCL, he's not the only UCL part of this, but he's the kind of founding stone. Keep going. At UCL. One of his most recent publications is the extraordinarily erudite edition of Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy. Today he will be speaking on contextualizing literature. Angus.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Katie. In the introduction to Forensic Shakespeare, Quentin's first book-length study primarily devoted to literary subject matter and published 6 years after he came to Queen Mary in 2008, we're told that it is the third instalment of a project on the place of the Ars Rhetorica in the history of Renaissance culture. The first instalment, as we've just been hearing, was given in the first volume of The Foundations of Modern Political Thought, published in 1978, where he traced the re-emergence of Roman rhetorical ideas in the city republics of Renaissance Italy and the influence they exerted on the theory and conduct of public life. The second instalment appeared in 1998, as we also just been hearing, in Reason and Rhetoric in the Philosophy of Hobbes, and gave a detailed reading of Hobbes' political thought through the contextual lens of classical rhetoric and its fortuna in England in the 16th and 17th centuries. In the third instalment, it's once again classical, especially Roman rhetoric, particularly as it was taught in the grammar schools of Elizabethan and Jacobean England, that supplies the intellectual context for the reading of Shakespeare, elaborated in Forensic Shakespeare. Now, it would be the very definition of methodological madness to question Quentin's description of his own work, so I'm not going to do that. But there is another way of seeing his preoccupation with classical rhetoric, or lots of different ways, and Katie just been giving us a very interesting biographical one. But there's another way of seeing this preoccupation with rhetoric and its Renaissance humanist reworking, that's to say, as a methodological development. And we can use this, I think, to ruminate more broadly about the relationship between contextualist intellectual history and literary studies. More or less from the start, as we know, Quentin theorised intellectual history as the study of texts as intentional artefacts, adopting Austin's account of linguistic action or speech act theory, to make the general claim that historians should be thinking about what authors were doing or what they were up to when they wrote what they did. This was a trans-historical theory of a kind because it could theoretically be applied to texts from any period or place, even if the historically contingent survival of relevant evidence meant that some texts, especially very old ones, were less susceptible to attempts to retrieve their author's intentions. One question that was left open was whether all texts, or let's say all texts likely to interest intellectual historians, were repositories of intentionality in more or less the same way across time and space. What classical rhetoric provided by way of a solution to this question was a rigorously historical theory of linguistic action in which persuasion was the central aim. Austin himself had been educated in the major texts of classical rhetoric. Just as Cicero's speeches can be viewed through the lens of his rhetorical treatises to illustrate what he thought he was up to, so Renaissance texts, at least those composed by those with a humanistic education, can be viewed through the lens of Renaissance rhetoric to illustrate what their authors thought they were up to. This was demonstrably productive as a way of understanding texts of early modern political thought, composed by their authors, self-consciously using the tools of classical rhetoric as persuasive artefacts. Reason and Rhetoric, in fact, showed not just that Hobbes was adept at using the tools of classical rhetoric, but also that he had a pressing concern with the misuse of these tools by others in English political discourse at the time. Classical and Renaissance rhetoric then provided a linguistic context for understanding what Hobbes was up to, as well as how he was up to it. This double interest in classical rhetoric as both linguistic context, providing the range of reference for the understanding of individual speech acts, and as the object of those speech acts themselves continued in forensic Shakespeare, where we see Shakespeare employing the tools of judicial rhetoric to dramatise scenes in which characters are moved to accuse and defend. But the significant shift in genre from Hobbes to Shakespeare can also prompt us to think about the application of contextualist intellectual history to literary texts, by which I mean just the kind of texts conventionally belonging to literary studies. Time is obviously limited, so I want to focus on the main contours of the contextualization in forensic Shakespeare. To me, what's most striking is how meticulously circumscribed it is. Its application is limited to works composed between 1595 and around 1600. That's the poem Lucrece and what Quentin calls the forensic plays Romeo and Juliet, Merchant of Venice, Julius Caesar, and Hamlet. It's also restricted to the passages and speeches in which the technical features of judicial rhetoric, especially inventio and dispositio, were demonstrably incorporated by Shakespeare, although the wider implications of these passages and speeches are drawn out in various ways. And perhaps most importantly, it's limited, as Quentin says, to explanation of why these passages and speeches have a recurrent pattern and arrangement. Actually, it does go further than that, because in various places we're shown how Shakespeare used these tools to elicit and exploit the responses anticipated from those with the same training in the audience, especially in those moments that Quentin calls rhetorical silence, where conventional expectations are raised only to be defeated. We're also shown how the linguistic context supplies meaning to vocabulary that's been previously misunderstood. The words foul, honest, matter, question, and cause were all rhetorically heavily loaded with forensic technical baggage. Ambiguous meanings and lack of resolution are contextualized and identified as rhetorical equivocations and two-sided arguments properly belonging in the courtroom, giving the lie to the charge that intellectual history is ill-suited to grappling with subtleties of textual meaning. Nevertheless, the explanation explicitly does not become interpretation in the sense of the analysis or deconstruction of a text with a view to issuing judgment on its value. Interpretation of that kind is fine, and it will always happen, of course, but it's not the province of contextual explanation. Now, this, I think, is an important point, and it helps to bring features of contextual analysis into close relief. What forensic Shakespeare does is illustrate the argumentative strategies employed by Shakespeare's characters in particular speeches, and more broadly, Shakespeare's classical humanist intellectual allegiance in dramatising the rhetorical dimensions of those speeches. It shows what Shakespeare used at certain points in his dramaturgy when his characters are in situations where they deliver arguments to get Shakespeare's imagination on the move. What it doesn't attempt to do is address the non-argumentative features of the plays. The plays weren't and aren't simply arguments or simply collections of arguments. Classical rhetoric provides the context for explaining important features of the texts, but there's no claim in forensic Shakespeare that it provides the key to unlock all of the play's deep meanings, whatever those might be.
So I'd like to introduce Professor Angus Gowland.
Groundhog Day.
He's from UCL.
Where was I? Thank you. I think I was about halfway through. I think what I was saying was contextual analysis explains things, doesn't interpret them. Right, that's it. Right, okay, no, seriously. So, forensic Shakespeare in particular poses a question of how the kinds of contextual explanation produced by intellectual historians relates to the work being done in literary studies, particularly literary studies that self-describe as historical. On one level, perhaps the subdisciplinary labels don't really matter. There are just scholars scrutinising texts with historical questions in mind. It's pretty clear, I think, that the scholarship that continues in the most traditionally historicist vein of literary studies is basically compatible with Cambridge School contextualism. The cardinal sins of anachronism and mythologies such as prolepsis, influentialism, parochialism, and so on are also outlawed in the scholarship required in venerable journals like the Review of English Studies. In this kind of work, the interpretive search for the deeper meanings and the issuing of judgments of value are permissible and desirable, but they're anchored in and disciplined by historical explanations of textual meaning. The relationship, though, with other branches of literary study is less straightforward. I remember Quentin commenting approvingly in 1997, I think. Well, I know it was 1997 because it was when I was first a graduate student. In 1997, he was commenting on the way Stephen Greenblatt and other new historicists had dissolved the boundary between the literary and non-literary texts of the past. What they'd seen, to their great credit, given the veneration of canonical literary works, is that in the end, there were just texts. And as Quentin added, whilst the genres of those texts would always be essential in framing the questions that could be legitimately asked of them in historical inquiry, all texts expressed relationships with the environments in which they were produced, whether they belonged to Shakespearean tragedy, local religious polemic, or erudite natural history. Identify the right kind of context, often easier said than done, of course, and through contextualizing, the historical meanings of the text will emerge. On the other hand, from the 1990s onwards, if not before, the divergences between some of the less traditional strands of historicist literary criticism and Cambridge School contextualism were becoming clear. Greenblatt and the new historicists, just like Raymond Williams and the cultural materialists, were reacting against the notion, associated with formalist literary criticism, that literature was inherently non-political and stood above politics on an aesthetically higher plane. But the procedure of investigating the political dimension of literature in the hands of the new historicists tended to collapse into the question about the possibility of ideological resistance to structures of power, which, for the new historicists and for the cultural materialists, was a quasi-Marxist question, or for the new historicists was more of a quasi-Foucauldian question. Every text could be presented through this filter as political in this way, a document of submission or resistance to hegemonic ideology, but not really political in senses that didn't fit within post-1960s campus politics. Looking back, it's clear that the historicism of the new historicists was pretty thin and rarely involved what intellectual historians would regard as a proper excavation of the political, religious, moral, or social languages of the past in order to reconstruct the context of the texts. They were more interested in using the texts of the past to express the dynamics of power and agency, or rather, lack of agency, as these had been described by Foucault and others. The overriding concern with these dynamics is striking, as is its persistence as a major preoccupation of cultural studies. But if it is a kind of historicist concern, it's a disappointingly flat and not very historical kind of historicism. If we take forensic Shakespeare as a model of an intellectual history / literary scholarship, then we can see it presents challenges. Contextualizing portions of Shakespeare's text through the Renaissance Ars Rhetorica gives us a rigorous explanation of what Shakespeare was doing in writing the judicial defence speech of Shylock in Act 4 of The Merchant of Venice, which Emily was referring to earlier. And so an account of Shakespeare's intentions in writing that speech. But as those who've read Visions of Politics Volume 1 would fully expect, the contextualization doesn't try to tell us Shakespeare's motivation, what was going on in his head and moving him to write. And it doesn't try to produce an overarching interpretation that can be the basis for a value judgment of the play as literature, or for a statement of Shakespeare's personal worldview. Consider then this claim by Stephen Greenblatt, made in an essay in the CUP volume Shakespeare in Early Modern Political Thought, which Andrew was one of the editors, on Shakespeare's notion of the moral personality. For Shakespeare, Greenblatt writes, there was no such thing as a characterless self. A conception of the moral self as characterless was not for Shakespeare a philosophical blunder so much as it was an undoing or denial of his life's work. Now, this is interesting, and it may or may not be right, but the projection into the mind of the author and into Shakespeare's view of his own oeuvre and of the human condition is breathtaking. Exactly how it's possible to make claims about Shakespeare's conception of the moral self or of his life's work in the absence of a treatise by him on ethics or an autobiography or a divinely inspired infusion of the soul of the dead author is unclear to say the least. The same has to be said for the procedure of ascribing political beliefs and affiliations to authors who didn't write directly in their own voice. Contextualizing the plays by situating them in the environment of late Elizabethan and early Jacobean politics and political discourse might show how Shakespeare used politics and political discourse as material for his dramaturgy. But it will never be able to answer the question, was he a Republican? Shakespeare did not write De Cive. If he did have a political theory, it's irretrievable. One of the messages I take from forensic Shakespeare is a somewhat chastening one for literary and cultural studies. If genres serve as guides for contextual explanation, they must also serve strictly as constraints. At the same time, though, the book serves positively as a model for contextualizing literature in its carefully documented movement from a taught compositional method, judicial rhetoric, to the explanation of textual characteristics, the identification of dimensions of historical meaning that have previously been obscured, and ultimately to their anticipated effects on the audience. I suggested earlier that Quentin's decision to privilege rhetoric as the linguistic context for studying Hobbes and then Shakespeare was no accident, and that it was in some ways an extension of his methodology. But at the same time, it's just one linguistic context of many that could be applied. Many authors have written and continue to write, not to persuade, but to give pleasure, to excite wonder and imaginative stimulation, to comfort, to unsettle. In the educated circles of early modern Europe, poetics and what would later be aesthetics also supplied authors with tools for doing other kinds of things with words. But zooming out, elsewhere and in different periods, the important linguistic contexts aren't explicitly theorized products of formal compositional methods like rhetoric or poetics, so much as assemblages of practices that have grown up in the ecological niches of particular educational and literary cultures. As intellectual history broadens its geographical and temporal horizons, the process of identifying and delineating those practices as linguistic contexts is beset with all sorts of difficulty. What makes forensic Shakespeare so compelling as a case study, I think, is how tightly the contextualization is anchored in an account of an educational culture embodied in the Elizabethan grammar school, where Shakespeare acquired his rhetorical tools, which he then, as was shown in detail, set about using to powerful effect. But as many of you know, the task of contextualizing works by authors who emerged from the more diffuse and intellectually eclectic educational cultures that developed in Europe after the decline of Renaissance humanism, and especially beyond Europe, to a comparable standard of scholarly precision is formidable. That, as we've been hearing today, is just one of Quentin's many essential contributions to intellectual history, and it's also a challenge that I think our discipline needs to meet. Thank you.
So due to the interruption, we've decided that the best way to ask questions of Katie and Angus will be over a glass of wine. Before we do that, however, I'd like the real Quentin Skinner to stand up and say a few words, and then we'll go upstairs to level 4 for the drinks. Quentin. It's green. Is that right? There's a lapel mic if you'd rather.
Thanks, Kate.
This one doesn't work.
Otherwise, with the red shows that it's on. It's a low battery is showing.
This one definitely works.
It does work.
Yeah. That's on. Has to go on the outside.
Well, I hope I'm not going to overheat things, which I think Angus may have done. And I'm certainly not going to attempt an academic speech, if only because I'm haunted by the definition of lecturers as people who talk in other people's sleep. But I do very much want to, that was a joke, I do very much want to offer what I'm going to think of as a kind of chronology of thanks for the 15 years I've spent here in the School of History. Now, first in my chronology comes Philip Ogden. whom I'm delighted to have seen here today, of course, and to whom I owe very many thanks for his opening remarks. It was Philip, as Vice Principal, who invited me to join Queen Mary. Although, as I think he mentioned, subsequently it emerged that he'd been encouraged by Daniel Pick, and I think Warren Boucher, and certainly by the late and great Lisa Jardine, who'd by then been inviting me here, greatly to my pleasure, for some years to talk to her students. Well, at the time Philip contacted me, I was teaching at Cambridge, as he mentioned, where there was and still is a compulsory retiring age, and I just didn't feel ready to retire from teaching. I've always thought of myself basically as a teacher, and so I was very thrilled at the opportunity to continue. The contract was for 3 years, but somehow no one seemed to notice that the 3 years was up, and it became 15 years. That was fine by me. However, I was very clear at the time that it might simply look wrong to appoint someone to the school who was then 68 when the money could have been spent on a junior post. So I've always been especially grateful for the fact and for the tact with which Philip ensured that my position was in fact never a charge on the school. It may have been a charge on the School of Dentistry, and I rather think it was, but that's definitely as much as I ever cost the School of History, and that was a wonderful thing that Philip organised. Actually, he organised so many wonderful things, didn't he, including this building. Just a problem about the fire. Anyway, that made a very good start for me, and Philip has remained a mentor and a friend. And when he showed me the street in which he thought Susie and I should buy a house, we found that we'd done so. Now, next in my chronological thanks comes Richard Burke, together with Angus Gowland at UCL. They've both spoken today with characteristic brilliance and generosity and great thoughtfulness this afternoon. And special thanks to Angus for enduring something which would have felled the concentration of most of us, I think. But what I really want to celebrate is that it was Angus and it was Richard who secured the future of intellectual history here in the University of London. The year before I arrived at QM, Richard and Angus had set up the MA in the History of Political Thought, a remarkable initiative in many ways, and not least the fact that they invoked and continue to invoke the basically federal character of the University of London as it used to be, and thus set up a joint MA. That proved a massive help in recruitment, and it also gave an exceptional strength in teaching, which has been further augmented, of course, in connections which have been established more recently by Andrew, with Birkbeck, and also, of course, with KCL, with Hannah Dawson contributing so much, and showing you this afternoon what a riveting teacher she is. Well, that MA proved a great initiative on Richard and Angus's part, notable for the number of students who've gone on from that MA to do PhDs here at QM, and have then moved successfully into academic life. We've heard from three of the most outstanding of them this afternoon, Max and Emily and Katie, though I'm shocked at the breach of confidence that my school, which was... Well, actually, with those three people, you see the future of intellectual history, and to me, it looks a very bright future when I hear them. But as well as that great trio, I'd like to mention others, if I may, whom I taught the PhD as well as the MA level, who progressed along this same trajectory into academic life, and did so with success. I want particularly to mention Alexandra Chadwick, now at the University of Ivascula, Sidney Gutnick-Allen, now at the University of Zurich, Joanna Paul, who became a senior lecturer at the University of Sussex before deciding to go freelance, Claire Whitehead, whose PhD I supervised jointly with Warren Boucher, who moved from a postdoctoral position into academic research administration with great success. Vanessa Lim, whose PhD I supervised jointly with David Colclough, who now holds a professorship at the Seoul National University, and Katie Abner-Landy, whose PhD I also supervised jointly with David, now a member of the Society of Fellows at Harvard. I'd like, if I may, to add two thoughts about that list. One is that I am proud of the fact that among the PhD students I've supervised at QM, all of those who have gone on into academic life have been women, for whom that progression is much more difficult and remains so than it has ever been for men. The other is that I'm happy to show you that that list also indicates close links that I've been able to maintain with our very distinguished and friendly Department of English here at QM. And I especially want to mention Warren and David. Well, I've spoken of PhD supervision, but most of my teaching at QM over these past 15 years has been at the MA level. And in this chronology of thanks, I very much want to pay tribute to my closest colleagues who've taught for that same MA degree course. Richard Burke, of course, and also Georgios Varoufakis and Gareth Stedman-Jones, and since 2019, Wasim Yacoub, and also Andrew Fitzmaurice, who stepped into the position so formidably occupied by Richard Burke before Richard departed to his chair in Cambridge in 2018, and who has continued Richard's great work, the pioneer here, with such tremendous commitment, and has further, as a result, secured the future of intellectual history as a teaching subject here in London. And I just want to add also that from all of these colleagues, I've never experienced anything other than the greatest tolerance and helpfulness. And I've also learnt a great deal from them, so thank you all. Now, bringing my chronology fully up to date, I want in particular to be sure of thanking Andrew for organising this occasion, which he did with great thoughtfulness and also with a mighty amount of patience, which I should add was shared by all our speakers in the face of the need to keep changing the dates. And last, but absolutely not least, I want to thank all those colleagues who kept the School of History at QM going for the rest of us throughout the years I've been here. I have been greatly impressed, this was absolutely never the case in Cambridge, that all through this time, eminent colleagues stepped up to chair the school. And have been, partly of course due to their eminence, impressively successful in protecting our interests in these very difficult times. And in addition, all of us have owed, and I felt this very much all the time I've been here, so much to the administrative staff of the school, marvellously led by Emma Yates. And to go into that office, I found, was, over all these years, to meet invariable kindness as well as professionalism. And I have so much benefited from that too. In fact, as you see, I've benefited in everything from moving from Cambridge to London. And so, to all these students and colleagues, and to all of you who've come on this occasion today, I just want to say thank you all very much. Thank you.
Well, I first came across his work when I did the History of Political Thought MPhil at Cambridge that he was so influential in creating. And it got me interested in that kind of history, and that's why I'm doing a History of Political Thought PhD today. I would say that his approach to thinking about history and thinking about political ideas continues to inspire me and really shape how I do my own work, and that he provides an incredibly intimidating model of what a historian can be.
It has been a marvelous privilege working with Quentin Skinner over the 15 years he spent with us. I, from time to time, was the director of the MA during those years. The degree to which the students were coming for him, asking about his course, almost all of them always taking his course. The only problem was he was always too popular. So if we had 25 students, 22 of them would want to take his course. But that's what success, that's a good thing. The other thing was we would always offer to have somebody else help with the marking, or he would never allow that. He wanted to do it himself, and he would always be the first to finish very professionally. But I think the most telling thing of the whole thing is that he didn't even have to teach, he wanted to teach. So the vice principal for the humanities, Philip Ogden, who is here, told me when Quentin was about to come to Queen Mary, if only he goes around the world saying he's at Queen Mary, that's enough for me. But he wants to teach. He wants to teach for the MA. How wonderful. So that's how lucky we are. Thank you, Quentin.